The moment the federal canine sank its teeth into his mistress's designer luggage, my husband let out a choked gasp that echoed across the Jackson Hole Airport terminal. I took a slow sip of my vanilla latte and watched his multi-million-dollar empire burn to ash. He thought I was about to spend the rest of my life rotting in a Mexican prison. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime, framing me for international drug smuggling, while he walked away with his young executive coordinator and a stolen fortune. What he failed to realize was that I had already audited his flawless plan, and I had quietly rewritten the ending. My name is Olivia, and I am 34 years old. Today, I stood in the priority security line, waiting for a steel trap to snap shut on the man I married. If you have ever had to outsmart a narcissist who mistook your silence for weakness, tell me your age in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to Samantha Told Stories. You will not want to miss this execution. 24 hours earlier, the Wyoming wind howled against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of our High Plains estate. The digital clock on the nightstand projected a harsh red 2 in the morning. I lay perfectly still on my side of the bed, my breathing regulated into the deep, rhythmic cadence of a woman submerged in sleep. Every muscle in my body remained locked, but my senses were sharp, tracking the shifting weight on the mattress behind me. The sudden absence of Nathan's body heat sent a chill down my spine. A freezing draft seeped through the cracked window, carrying the crisp scent of pine and snow. But something else lingered in the air, clashing with the sterile cold. As he leaned over me to check if I was truly asleep, a faint, sickening scent of vanilla perfume drifted from his collar. It was Aubrey's signature fragrance, a cheap, cloying contrast to the rugged Wyoming night. I kept my eyes shut, peeking only through the barest slit of my lashes. Nathan stood silhouetted against the moonlight spilling over the hardwood floor. He did not head toward the bathroom or the kitchen for a glass of water. Instead, he moved with a practiced predatory silence toward my sleek black suitcase. The luggage sat open in the corner, neatly packed for our upcoming getaway to Cabo San Lucas. He knelt on the wool rug. From the pocket of his sweatpants, he pulled a small utility knife. The faint metallic click of the blade extending sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. My chest tightened, demanding oxygen, but I forced my lungs to maintain their slow, sleeping rhythm. I watched him run his hand along the bottom structure of my luggage, finding the seam of the internal nylon lining. With a quick downward motion, he sliced the fabric open. The tearing thread hissed in the dark. He reached into his jacket draped over a nearby chair and retrieved an object roughly the size of a thick paperback book. It was wrapped tightly in layers of heavy industrial plastic. Even in the dim light, the dense white powder packed inside the vacuum seal was unmistakable. Synthetic opioids. A trafficking quantity designed to trigger a mandatory life sentence south of the border. But that was not all. Taped securely to the side of the narcotic brick was a ruggedized military-grade hard drive. He wedged the entire package deep into the cavity of my suitcase, pressing it flat against the polycarbonate shell to ensure it did not create an unnatural bulge. He smoothed the sliced fabric back into place, meticulously repacking my folded dresses over the hidden compartment to conceal his handiwork. He patted the top of the luggage, letting out a soft, satisfied exhale. He was signing my death warrant, and he was doing it with a smile. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not confront him. The fragile, trusting wife he thought he knew died in that exact second. What remained was the woman who had spent a decade working as a senior compliance auditor for the most ruthless mineral extraction firms in the state. I spent my career hunting financial anomalies, dismantling corporate fraud, and burying executives who thought they were untouchable. Nathan assumed I was just a domestic accessory, a convenient, quiet cover story for his ambitious life. He brought a pocket knife to a war against a woman who dismantled hidden fortresses for a living. Nathan walked back to the bed, slipped under the heavy duvet, and closed his eyes. Within 10 minutes, his breathing deepened into a steady snore. He slept with the peace of a man who believed he had secured his future at the cost of mine. I waited another half hour watching the moon track across the ceiling. The silence of the isolated estate pressed in from all sides. Slowly, I pushed the covers aside. The hardwood floor bit into my bare feet as I glided across the room, bypassing the creaking floorboards I had memorized over the years. I knelt beside my suitcase. The vanilla scent still clung to the fabric of his discarded jacket, nearby a quiet taunt in the dark. My fingers traced the jagged cut in the nylon lining. Reaching into the cold darkness of the shell, I gripped the heavy plastic brick and pulled it free. It weighed at least 3 pounds. The calculated malice required to plant such a thing in a spouse's luggage radiated from the cold plastic. I tucked the package against my ribs, stood up, and carried it down the long hallway toward my private home office. I closed the heavy oak door and engaged the deadbolt. The only light came from the blue glow of my secure auditing workstation booting up. I set the contraband on the glass desk. Using a crafting scalpel, I carefully peeled the tape holding the hard drive to the narcotics, preserving the adhesive perfectly so it could be resealed without a trace. The drive was cold metal heavy and imposing, engineered to withstand extreme conditions and resist forced entry. I plugged the drive into my offline terminal. A sleek password prompt flashed across the monitor. Nathan was a prominent CEO of a heavy machinery and logistics firm. He dealt with lucrative contracts, assuming his operational security was impenetrable. But arrogance breeds predictability. He viewed me as a housewife, ignoring the fact that I mapped hidden corporate ledgers before we ever met. I launched a decryption protocol I had engineered years ago for penetrating offshore tax havens. Lines of green code cascaded down the screen, systematically attacking his digital lock. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the brick of synthetic poison resting on my desk. He wanted to trap me at a federal checkpoint. He wanted to watch me get dragged away in handcuffs while he flew to a tropical paradise with Aubrey. I took a slow breath, letting the icy Wyoming night fill my lungs. The executioner had laid his trap, but he forgot to check who was holding the axe. A sharp chime echoed from the computer speakers. The encryption barrier fell. The drive mounted onto my desktop. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the keyboard, and opened the first directory. The screen flared with a harsh white light, illuminating the dark corners of my home office. The first directory opened with a hollow click. It was labeled with a generic project code, a classic diversion tactic used by every corrupt executive I used to investigate during my tenure auditing Wyoming mineral operations. I opened the folder. Dozens of drafted emails populated the screen. They were meticulously forged to look as though they originated from my personal internet protocol address. The messages were directed to anonymous suppliers across the southern border, discussing logistical arrangements for transporting synthetic opioids. He had captured my tone with terrifying accuracy. The polite greetings, the structured bullet points, the concise sign-offs. It was a digital confession painted in my voice, expressing deep regret for letting financial greed push me into international smuggling. Alongside the fabricated emails sat a sprawling spreadsheet of offshore routing numbers. These were bank accounts located in jurisdictions immune to standard federal subpoenas. I recognized the formatting immediately. I did not yet have access to the deep archive detailing the exact origin of the stolen funds, but the surface data was more than enough to paint a devastating picture. If I had walked into Jackson Hole Airport blind today, Federal agents would have found the drugs cracked this drive and concluded I was the criminal mastermind. Nathan would play the devastated, betrayed husband, while I disappeared into a foreign penal system. A hollow ache bloomed in my chest. To understand the sheer cruelty of this setup, you have to rewind to a crisp afternoon just 1 week ago. We were standing on our cedar deck overlooking the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons. The sky was an unforgiving, pristine blue. The vast High Plains basin stretched out below us, a beautiful but isolating landscape. Wyoming is the least populous state in the country. When your nearest neighbor is miles down a dirt road, the only reality you have is the one constructed inside your own house. Nathan knew how to manipulate that geography. That afternoon, I had confronted him about a discrepancy I noticed in our joint accounts. A quiet wire transfer that did not align with his logistics firm's usual capital expenditures. Instead of answering my question, Nathan let out a long, exhausted sigh. He turned to face me, the freezing mountain wind whipping his expensive wool coat around his legs. He did not yell. He did something far more insidious. He looked at me with deep, manufactured pity. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small amber prescription bottle. He placed the rattling plastic cylinder into my palm, wrapping his warm fingers firmly over mine. "You are exhausted, Olivia," he whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You used to spend 80 hours a week hunting for phantom assets in the extraction industry. Now, you are bringing that same toxic suspicion into our home. You are seeing ghosts where there are none. Take one of these. Take the edge off your paranoid delusions before you ruin this marriage." Paranoid delusions. He weaponized my career against me. For months, he systematically dismantled my confidence. If I questioned a late-night text message from Aubrey, he claimed my isolation in Wyoming was making me irrationally jealous. If I asked why he changed the passcodes on his home office safe, he told me my old auditor habits were manifesting as an obsessive control disorder. He slowly built an invisible cage around my mind, forcing me to doubt my own memory, my own vision, my own sanity. I actually started taking those pills. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if my demanding past had fractured my perception of reality. He wanted me weak, doubtful, and compliant. He wanted the perfect, oblivious scapegoat. Sitting in the blue glow of my monitor, the last remnants of that manufactured self-doubt evaporated. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from a sudden, sharp realization of the psychological torture I had endured. The grief of losing the man I thought I married threatened to crush my chest. My throat tightened. A warm tear pricked the corner of my eye. I blinked it away. I refused to cry for a ghost. The fragile, broken wife he tried to create stayed out in the cold. I clamped down on the emotional hemorrhage and let the forensic auditor take the wheel. The numbers made sense. The forgery made sense. The betrayal was no longer a tragedy. It was a data set. I reached for a secure, encrypted flash drive of my own and plugged it into the terminal. I systematically copied every forged email, every routing number, every digital footprint he left on the Surface directory. I was stripping away his ammunition and securing it for my own arsenal. The progress bar hummed across the screen, a steady march toward his ruin. 10%, 40%, 80%. Every megabyte transferred was another nail in his coffin. Once the transfer completed, I safely ejected the drive and tucked it securely into the pocket of my slacks. I returned my attention to the heavy brick of narcotics resting on my glass desk. Using the same precision scalpel, I slid the military-grade hard drive back into its original position against the vacuum-sealed plastic. I retrieved a roll of matte black binding tape from my desk drawer, identical to the type Nathan used, and carefully wrapped the incision. I pressed the adhesive flat, eliminating any trapped air bubbles, restoring the package to its flawless, deadly state. I carried the dense weight back down the dark hallway. The Wyoming estate was dead silent. I slipped back into the master bedroom. Nathan was still submerged in his deep, ignorant slumber, his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. I knelt beside my open black suitcase. I did not slip the package back into the cut lining. That was his design. Instead, I left the torn nylon exposed and rearranged my folded dresses to make it appear undisturbed. I zipped the main compartment shut. I took the narcotic brick into my expansive walk-in closet and buried it at the very bottom of my oversized leather tote bag. I concealed it beneath my laptop sleeve, a heavy wool scarf, and a leather makeup pouch. I would carry this bag over my shoulder, keeping the evidence within arm reach during the morning commute. By the time I slipped back under the heavy duvet, the digital clock read 5 a.m. The horizon beyond the high plains basins began to glow with a faint, bruised purple light. The morning sun crept over the geothermal ridges, casting long, sharp shadows across the bedroom floor. My mind calculated the exact sequence of events required for the next 6 hours. The trap was set, but the board still needed to be flipped. The alarm on Nathan's nightstand buzzed with a harsh electronic tone. He groaned, stretching his arms over his head before rolling over to face me. He offered a warm, boyish smile. It was the kind of smile that had convinced me to leave my career and move to this isolated mountain town 5 years ago. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear, and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Are you ready for paradise?" I looked directly into his eyes, matching his warm, devoted expression flawlessly. "I am ready for everything, Nathan." The freezing wind sweeping off the high plains cut through my wool coat the moment I stepped onto the driveway. Our idling luxury vehicle exhaled thick plumes of white exhaust into the frigid morning air. Nathan stood by the open trunk, a picture of rugged executive grace in his tailored cashmere overcoat. He reached for my sleek black luggage, wrapping his gloved hands around the handle. A tight, suppressed smirk danced at the corner of his mouth as he hoisted the suitcase into the cargo hold. He treated the object with delicate reverence, believing he was carefully securing the instrument of my impending downfall. He patted the hard polycarbonate shell, sealing the hatch with a solid thud. I stood on the frost-covered pavement, clutching my oversized leather tote against my ribs. Hidden at the very bottom, buried beneath a laptop sleeve and a thick cashmere scarf, rested the dense, vacuum-sealed brick of synthetic poison and the decrypted hard drive. The weight of the contraband pulled at my shoulder, a heavy, physical reminder of the lethal game we were playing. I offered Nathan a bright, unburdened smile. He opened the rear passenger door for me, gesturing inside with an exaggerated display of chivalry. I slid onto the heated leather seat, maintaining my composed facade. The interior of the vehicle was suffocatingly warm, filled with a scent that made my stomach twist. Sitting in the front passenger seat, twisting around to greet me with a blindingly white smile, was Aubrey. "Good morning, Olivia," she chimed, her voice echoing with manufactured sweetness. Aubrey was 27 years old, wearing a pristine tailored blazer and an air of unearned entitlement. She had joined Nathan's logistics firm 18 months ago as an executive coordinator. Prior to her arrival, the company functioned smoothly under seasoned management. Once she stepped into the boardroom, she quickly transitioned from scheduling flights to inserting herself into confidential operational decisions. She possessed a ruthless ambition masked by a polished, polite exterior. She viewed me as a relic, a boring domestic fixture taking up space in the life she intended to claim. "I hope you do not mind sharing the ride," Nathan said, settling into the driver's seat and shifting the vehicle into gear. Aubrey has an urgent corporate layover in Denver before joining the regional conference. It made sense to consolidate our trip to the terminal. The excuse was painfully flimsy. A prominent chief executive and his junior coordinator sharing a ride to a romantic vacation departure flight was an insult to my intelligence. Yet I did not challenge the narrative. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my heavy tote. "It makes perfect sense," I replied, keeping my tone light and pleasant. "Carpooling is incredibly efficient. Besides, it is always lovely to catch up before a long flight." The vehicle pulled away from our sprawling estate, navigating the winding mountain roads. The vast snow-blanketed basins of Wyoming stretched out in every direction, flanked by the towering, jagged silhouettes of the Grand Tetons. The isolation of the landscape mirrored the psychological warfare unfolding inside the cabin. We were trapped in a moving steel box, 3 people playing distinct roles in a theater of deception. Nathan and Aubrey did not bother to hide their mutual satisfaction. They believed they were the predators circling a clueless victim. Every few miles, they exchanged quick, knowing glances in the rearview mirror. Their conversation flowed with an effortless, arrogant rhythm, laced with coded inside jokes that were meant to humiliate me right to my face. "I am really looking forward to the fourth quarter restructuring," Aubrey noted, tracing a manicured fingernail along the edge of her seatbelt. "The logistics division has been carrying far too much dead weight lately. It is time we streamline our operations and focus on the future." Nathan chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that once brought me comfort. "You are entirely correct, Aubrey. Trimming the excess baggage is the only way this company will reach its true potential. Sometimes you just have to cut your losses and leave the unnecessary burdens behind. You will see a huge difference by next week." The double meaning hung in the suffocating cabin air. They were openly discussing my impending imprisonment, comparing my life to discarded corporate liability. They reveled in the thrill of their secret, intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. I tilted my head, looking out the window at the passing pine trees. "That sounds like a wonderful strategy, Nathan," I murmured. "Efficiency is key. You can never truly move forward if you are holding on to things that no longer serve a purpose." Aubrey smirked, turning her head toward the windshield to hide her cruel amusement. She thought I was agreeing with my own obsolescence. I shifted my gaze to the floorboard beneath her feet. Resting securely against the console was her pristine designer carry-on bag. It was crafted from expensive cream canvas, featuring a prominent gold zipper along the side compartment. She had positioned it carelessly, unbothered and confident. That cream canvas bag was the exact target for my counterstrike. I calculated the spatial distance between my seat and her luggage, mapping out the precise physical movements required to transfer the contraband once we reached the chaotic terminal. To maintain the illusion of a normal business commute, Nathan shifted the conversation toward his actual corporate frustrations. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel, his brow furrowing in genuine irritation as we passed a sign for the national park. "The local zoning commissions are becoming a nightmare," he complained, his tone sharp. "I have millions tied up in heavy machinery transport, and we are constantly getting blocked by that Yellowstone Wildlife Conservation Fund. Those charity advocates are petitioning to restrict our primary trucking routes near the High Plains basins. They claim our extraction logistics are disrupting the geothermal ecosystems." Aubrey scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It is ridiculous. They are holding up major mineral leases over some migratory elk paths. You should just buy them out or bury them in legal fees. I do not want to spend another dime on them," Nathan snapped. If I could bankrupt that specific conservation fund tomorrow, I would do it without a second thought. They are the single biggest obstacle to our quarterly expansion. I listened intently, committing the name of the charity to memory. The Yellowstone Wildlife Conservation Fund. A seemingly minor detail, a trivial grievance from a wealthy executive, yet, in the intricate web of corporate finance, every vulnerability holds value. I filed the information away, recognizing a potential weapon for the future. The highway began to widen as we approached the airport perimeter. The tension inside the vehicle spiked, radiating off Nathan in palpable waves. He was nearing the finish line of his treacherous plot. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my serene expression. Perhaps my quiet demeanor unsettled him. He needed me to play the part of the fragile, anxious wife, not a calm observer. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving the familiar amber prescription bottle he had weaponized against me all week. He shook the plastic cylinder, the pills rattling loudly in the confined space. "Olivia, darling," he said, his voice dropping into that patronizing, sympathetic octave. "You have been so quiet this morning. I know travel always triggers your anxiety. Why do not you take one of these now? It will help you relax before we get to the crowded security lines. We do not want a repeat of your panic attacks." He extended his arm backward, holding a small white pill between his fingers. Aubrey watched from the front seat, a look of profound pity plastered across her face. "You really should take it, Olivia," Aubrey added, her tone laced with fake concern. "You look a bit pale. We want you to feel your best for the flight." I reached forward and took the pill from his fingers. The surface of the medication was chalky and dry. My mind was currently operating with razor-sharp precision, processing variables and calculating risks at a blinding speed. A sedative was the last thing I needed. I required absolute mental clarity to execute the physical sleight of hand awaiting me. "Thank you, Nathan," I whispered, offering a vulnerable, trembling smile. "You always know exactly what I need." I brought my hand to my mouth, pretending to swallow the medication, while seamlessly palming the small pill between my thumb and index finger. I took a sip from my travel water bottle, swallowing audibly to complete the performance. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my wool coat, discarding the intact pill into the deep fabric lining. Nathan exhaled a breath of relief, turning his attention back to the icy road. He believed his chemical leash was secure. He believed he had sedated his prey, ensuring I would walk blindly into the federal checkpoint without the mental capacity to question the impending disaster. The dense pine forest gave way to the sweeping snow-covered tarmac. The luxury SUV coasted up the curved driveway, coming to a smooth halt in front of the stunning, wood-paneled entrance of Jackson Hole Airport. The building was an architectural marvel of timber and glass, sitting beneath the shadows of the dramatic towering peaks. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the fresh snow. The air outside the vehicle was freezing, but the blood rushing through my veins burned with cold anticipation. We had arrived at the battleground. Nathan parked the car, his jaw set with ruthless determination. Aubrey slung her designer bag over her shoulder, stepping out into the frigid wind. I gripped the handles of my heavy leather tote, feeling the dense weight of the narcotic brick pressing against my side. The psychological standoff was over. The physical execution was about to begin. The Jackson Hole Airport Terminal is an architectural anomaly, sitting entirely within the boundaries of a national park. The structure features exposed timber beams, soaring ceilings, and roaring stone fireplaces, designed to welcome the elite who flock to the Wyoming slopes. Stepping through the sliding glass doors, the freezing mountain air clashed with the suffocating, frantic energy of the departure hall. Throngs of affluent travelers clad in designer winter gear and pristine boots navigated the tight spaces. People dragged cumbersome snowboards, oversized luggage, and heavy travel cases across the polished stone floors. The ambient noise created a thick auditory fog, a chaotic symphony of overlapping conversations, rolling wheels, and blaring intercom announcements. Nathan marched ahead of us, hauling a reinforced travel case containing his custom-crafted skis. He prided himself on his athletic pursuits, viewing the hazardous mountain slopes as just another arena to conquer and dominate. His specialized equipment required a separate drop-off counter located at the far end of the ticketing hall. He checked his platinum wristwatch, his jaw clenching with distinct impatience. Time was a variable he sought to control, and the crowded terminal threatened his meticulous schedule. He paused near a cluster of leather benches adjacent to a bustling artisanal coffee kiosk. The line for caffeine stretched long, filled with shivering tourists seeking warmth from the mountain draft. He dropped his standard roller bag near my feet, but kept a firm grip on the handle of his ski case. "Wait right here," Nathan instructed, his tone brisk and commanding. "The oversized baggage line is a disaster. I will drop these off and be back in 3 minutes. Do not wander off." Aubrey shivered, pulling the lapels of her tailored wool coat tighter against her neck. "I am freezing," she complained, her eyes darting toward the hissing espresso machines. "I need a hot latte before we deal with the security checkpoint. Watch my things, Olivia." She carelessly tossed her cream canvas designer carry-on onto the leather bench right next to my hip. Without waiting for a response, she pivoted on her heel and joined the back of the coffee queue. Her attention was already fixed on her glowing phone screen, her thumbs typing a rapid message. Nathan was already 50 yards away, weaving his broad shoulders through the dense crowd toward the distant counter. I was alone. The chaotic environment provided a flawless, bustling theater for deception. I calculated the spatial variables. 40 seconds. That was the maximum window of unobserved isolation I possessed before either of them turned around or broke from their respective distractions. My adrenaline spiked, sending a cold rush through my veins, but my breath remained remarkably even. My background in compliance auditing taught me how to operate under unyielding scrutiny. When federal regulators comb through your corporate ledgers looking for discrepancies, you learn to steady your hands and project serene compliance. You learn to breathe through the panic, to compartmentalize fear into actionable data. Today, that rigorous mental discipline kept my pulse from giving me away. I focused on the physical geometry of the task. 40 seconds was a generous margin if my movements were precise. I slid down the leather bench, closing the 6-inch gap between my body and Aubrey's luggage. Her carry-on featured a spacious exterior side compartment meant for magazines or a folded travel blanket. In her haste and self-assured arrogance, she had left the custom gold zipper parted halfway, creating a dark, inviting opening. I reached into my oversized leather tote. My fingers bypassed the padded laptop sleeve and the thick wool scarf, diving into the shadows at the bottom of the bag. My skin brushed against the cold, rigid edges of the vacuum-sealed package. The synthetic opioids and the encrypted military-grade hard drive formed a dense, heavy brick. It carried the weight of a lifetime prison sentence and a staggering financial fraud. I gripped it firmly, testing its heft against the strength of my wrist. A family of 5 rushed past the bench, their puffy coats and erratic movements blocking me from the main concourse view for a crucial 3 seconds. I seized the visual cover. I pulled the contraband from my tote, keeping it low, hidden beneath the drape of my open coat. The transfer was fluid and deliberate. I guided the dense brick directly into the gaping mouth of Aubrey's side compartment. It slid into the deep pocket, nestling perfectly against the internal lining, disappearing from sight. I needed to secure the compartment. My fingers pinched the custom gold zipper pull. Just outside the towering glass walls of the terminal, a commercial Boeing jet fired its turbines, preparing for takeoff on the icy runway. The deep, rumbling roar penetrated the building, vibrating the floorboards and drowning out all high-pitched frequencies. Using the auditory camouflage, I pulled the zipper shut. The sharp, metallic teeth locked together, the sound entirely swallowed by the deafening jet engine. The lethal cargo was relocated, but a seamless illusion requires a convincing flaw. I turned my attention back to my own leather tote. Instead of securing my bag, I intentionally left the top zipper wide open, exposing the inner lining and the corner of my laptop sleeve. I let the long leather strap hang awkwardly off my shoulder, cultivating the appearance of a sedated, clumsy traveler struggling to manage her belongings. 32 seconds had elapsed. Aubrey stepped out of the coffee line, a steaming paper cup in her hand. She marched back to the bench, her eyes scanning the digital departure boards mounted high above the ticketing counters. She did not spare a single glance at her luggage. She simply reached down and grabbed the handle of the cream canvas bag. Her wrist strained for a fraction of a second against the unexpected 3-pound addition. A tiny furrow appeared on her brow, but her mind instantly dismissed the physical discrepancy. She shifted her grip, adjusting the strap over her tailored shoulder. She was too absorbed in her own self-importance to question the altered physics of her own possessions. A moment later, Nathan emerged from the sea of passengers, his hands now free of the cumbersome ski gear. He strode toward us with the crisp, predatory gait of a man nearing a triumphant finish line. His eyes scanned our little group, landing immediately on my hanging, unzipped tote bag. I watched his facial muscles shift. A distinct, patronizing smirk touched the corner of his lips. He noted the careless state of my bag, the exposed contents, and my slightly slouched posture. In his mind, the anxiety pill he had forced upon me in the SUV was taking full effect. He saw a sluggish, negligent wife operating in a chemical fog, practically begging to be caught by the transportation authorities. The red herring worked flawlessly. He felt an intoxicating rush of superiority. His chest puffed out slightly under his cashmere coat. He believed his trap was proceeding with mechanical perfection, treating my perceived vulnerability as a personal victory. "All right, ladies," Nathan announced, his tone brimming with a manufactured, cheerful urgency. "Let us head to the screening area. The priority lane looks clear this morning, and I want to grab a drink in the lounge before we board." We merged into the river of passengers flowing toward the back of the terminal. Nathan walked slightly behind me, acting as a silent shepherd guiding a lamb to the slaughter. I felt the heat of his gaze fixed on my black suitcase rolling smoothly across the tile. He was practically vibrating with toxic anticipation, a coiled spring ready to snap. Every step brought us closer to the rigid boundaries of federal law enforcement. He thought he was walking me toward my destruction. He had no idea the executioner was strolling right beside him, maintaining a steady, measured pace. We approached the TSA security checkpoint, a sprawling gauntlet of stainless steel tables, gray plastic bins, and towering scanning machines. The air smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the nervous sweat of rushing travelers. The ambient noise shifted to the rattling of bins and the sharp commands of uniformed officers. Nathan positioned himself at my shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes locked on the scanning tunnel. The trap was armed, and he was eager to watch it spring. The priority lane at Jackson Hole Airport was cordoned off by thick velvet ropes, shielding the elite travelers from the general boarding masses. Nathan steered our trio toward an empty screening lane on the far right. He wanted an unobstructed view of the monitors. He placed a firm, guiding hand on the small of my back, propelling me forward with a forced, enthusiastic urgency. "Go ahead, honey," he urged, his voice carrying a strained high pitch. "Put your things on the belt. Let us get you cleared first so you can relax." He was positioning me on the firing line, stepping aside to grant himself the perfect vantage point for my incoming destruction. To an outsider, Nathan looked like the quintessential devoted husband, ensuring his anxious wife navigated the stressful travel protocol with ease. In his mind, he was already rehearsing the performance he would deliver when the authorities dragged me away. He would play the horrified spouse, weeping softly while explaining to the press that my prior high-pressure career auditing mineral extraction firms had clearly triggered a psychotic break. He had spent months laying the psychological groundwork, convincing our social circle that I was fragile and unpredictable. Now, he was ready to cash in on that narrative, securing his stolen fortune while I took the fall. I stepped up to the stainless steel table. The ambient drone of the terminal faded into a sharp, focused hum. I moved with practiced, unhurried grace. I slipped off my wool coat, folding it neatly into the first gray plastic bin. I placed my intentionally unzipped leather tote into a second bin, ensuring the empty laptop sleeve and mundane makeup pouches were clearly visible to any observer. Finally, I gripped the telescopic handle of my sleek black suitcase. Nathan hovered mere inches away. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. His eyes were wide and dilated, fixed entirely on the zipper of my luggage. He was waiting for the inevitable clash of alarms. He was holding his breath, waiting for my life to end. I hoisted the black suitcase and placed it squarely onto the black rubber conveyor belt. The heavy fabric settled against the rollers with a dull thud. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my sweater, and offered Nathan a serene, encouraging nod. The heavy rubber flaps of the scanner parted, swallowing my luggage into the dark scanning tunnel. I kept my gaze locked on Nathan. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He shifted his weight from one custom leather shoe to the other, craning his neck to secure a direct line of sight to the operator-illuminated monitor. The transportation security agent sitting behind the console looked profoundly bored. He chewed a piece of peppermint gum with a slow, mechanical rhythm, staring at the shifting landscape of colors on his screen. Bright blues indicated zippers and hardware, while dense oranges highlighted organic materials. Nathan leaned closer, his chest pressing against the side of the table. He was bracing for the sudden appearance of a dense, rectangular void on the monitor, the unmistakable signature of a vacuum-sealed narcotic brick, and a ruggedized hard drive. The conveyor belt hummed its steady, unbothered tune. The glowing image of my luggage scrolled smoothly across the screen. There was no dense anomaly. There was no hidden cavity glowing with threat. The agent blinked lazily, popped a bubble with his gum, and looked away. The heavy rubber flaps on the exit side of the machine parted, and my black suitcase rolled out into the bright terminal light, entirely untouched. I turned away from the belt and approached the advanced imaging technology scanner. I handed my boarding pass to the stoic guard, stepped inside the cylindrical machine, and raised my arms above my head. The mechanical arm whirred to life, rotating swiftly around my body. A few seconds later, the screen flashed a comforting green silhouette. No anomalies detected. I stepped out of the scanner, perfectly clean, legally unassailable, and entirely free. I walked casually over to the stainless steel collection area, retrieving my coat and pulling my luggage off the rollers. Then I looked back across the security lane at my husband. Nathan was frozen. He stood rooted to the linoleum floor, staring at the empty space on the conveyor belt where my suitcase had been just moments prior. The mathematical equation in his brain had short-circuited. He gripped the edge of the stainless steel inspection table so fiercely that his knuckles turned stark bone white. His reality was actively fracturing. I had spent a decade conducting compliance audits on corrupt executives, and the physiological response to a collapsed scheme is always identical. The color drained from Nathan's face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor in its wake. His breathing grew shallow and erratic, pulling in quick, insufficient gasps of air. He knew exactly what he had packed at 2 a.m. He vividly remembered the friction of the utility knife against the nylon lining. He remembered pressing the heavy brick into the frame of my suitcase. The laws of physics dictated that the contraband had to be there, yet the bag had passed federal scrutiny without raising a single red flag. His mind spun wildly, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Had the machine malfunctioned? Had the agent simply missed a substantial package? Did he somehow dream the entire late-night sabotage? The meticulous, arrogant chief executive was unraveling in the middle of the priority lane. His cognitive dissonance was palpable, a suffocating wave of panic crashing over his carefully constructed ego. He looked at the bored security agent, then back to the empty rubber flaps, and finally, his panicked gaze snapped across the checkpoint to meet mine. I did not frown. I did not look confused. I simply tilted my head and offered him the exact same cold, patronizing smile he used when he handed me those anxiety pills just an hour earlier. In that fraction of a second, the horrifying truth began to dawn on him. The trap had failed, and he had no idea where the lethal payload was currently sitting. His absolute control dissolved into paralyzing confusion.
"Sir, you need to move forward,"
a security agent barked, pointing impatiently at the empty space in front of Nathan.
"You are holding up the queue. Place your items in the bin and step through the detector."
Nathan jumped at the sharp command, his broad shoulders twitching. He fumbled blindly with his pockets, pulling out his wallet and phone with uncoordinated, jerky movements, dropping a silver money clip onto the steel table with a loud clatter. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine, waiting for the inevitable detonation. Right behind his paralyzing meltdown, Aubrey let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. She was entirely oblivious to the psychological earthquake destroying the man in front of her. She cared only about her own schedule and her own comfort, checking her watch with dramatic flair. "Nathan, honestly, what is taking so long?" she muttered, her high-pitched voice laced with entitlement. Stepping around his frozen, trembling frame, Aubrey grabbed the handles of her cream canvas designer carry-on. Eager to bypass the mundane security protocol and reach the luxury departure lounge, she heaved the heavy bag onto the metal rollers, shoving it impatiently toward the dark, gaping mouth of the X-ray tunnel. The cream canvas carry-on glided smoothly onto the black rubber rollers, entering the dark tunnel of the scanning machine. Aubrey stood near the collection zone, her posture radiating profound impatience. She checked her phone screen, tapping her manicured nails against the pristine casing. She had spent her brief professional career leveraging her youth and charm to bypass the standard corporate ladder, securing a direct line to the chief executive. She genuinely believed that dating Nathan shielded her from the mundane rules governing ordinary citizens. She assumed his wealth and influence formed an impenetrable barrier around her lifestyle. She was about to learn that federal law enforcement does not recognize corporate titles. Nathan remained rooted to the linoleum floor near the metal detector. He looked like a man drowning in shallow water. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The tailored cashmere overcoat that usually gave him a commanding silhouette now seemed to hang heavily on his trembling frame. His eyes darted frantically from my face to the empty plastic bins, unable to process the missing variable. The lethal cargo he had planted with his own hands was gone. The meticulous trap had vanished into thin air. He had not yet connected the dots. His reeling mind refused to accept the possibility that his junior coordinator was currently transporting a felony through a federal checkpoint. I stood a few feet away, holding my warm vanilla latte in both hands, letting the steam rise against my chin. I offered no comfort, no questions, and no reaction. I simply watched the theater of his destruction unfold with the clinical detachment of a seasoned auditor observing a failing ledger. Behind the reinforced glass of the security console, the transportation screener leaned closer to his glowing monitor. The rhythmic chewing of his peppermint gum ceased instantly. His spine snapped straight, pressing hard against the back of his ergonomic chair. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the shifting thermal image scrolling across his screen. Whatever anomaly he spotted within the side compartment of the designer luggage required no second guessing. His hand shot forward, hovering over the control panel for a fraction of a second before slamming down on a large red emergency button. The steady mechanical hum of the conveyor belt died instantly. The gears locked into place with a jarring metallic screech that echoed sharply off the high timber ceilings of the terminal. The sudden cessation of movement acted like a physical blow to the surrounding atmosphere. The murmuring crowd of affluent tourists and rushing business travelers fell silent, their attention snapping toward the stalled machine. Before Aubrey could even formulate a complaint, the situation escalated beyond any bureaucratic delay. A uniformed Customs and Border Protection officer sprinted into the priority screening zone from an adjacent corridor. He held a thick leather leash, his boots slipping slightly on the polished stone as he fought to restrain a muscular German shepherd. The canine operated on purebred instinct, its senses overwhelmed by the specific chemical signature radiating from the stalled scanner. The animal bypassed the stacked trays of laptops and discarded winter boots, zeroing in directly on the dark opening of the X-ray tunnel. Aubrey let out a sharp sigh of irritation, her brow furrowing in deep annoyance. She stepped forward, opening her mouth to scold the officer for holding up her pristine luggage. The indignant words died in her throat. The dog lunged. Planting its heavy front paws onto the stainless steel inspection table, the animal let out a ferocious, deafening bark that shook the air. It buried its snout into the cream canvas of Aubrey's carry, on its heavy claws tearing frantically at the expensive fabric. The canine was desperate to unearth the scent buried within the side compartment, scratching through the material with relentless power. Aubrey staggered backward, her expensive leather boots tangling over each other. Her arrogant, entitled posture collapsed in a single heartbeat. The exasperated sigh morphed into a high-pitched, breathless gasp of pure terror. She pressed her trembling hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking as the powerful animal decimated her prized possession. The reality of true, unyielding physical danger shattered her suburban bubble. She shrank against the glass partition, trying to distance herself from the terrifying display of force. High-decibel sirens pierced the terminal, a shrill, oscillating wail that signaled a severe security breach. Red strobe lights mounted along the ceiling beams flared to life, casting harsh, rhythmic shadows across the pale faces of the trapped passengers. The mundane, predictable routine of airport travel evaporated. In its place, the rigid, unforgiving machinery of federal law enforcement seized absolute control. Heavily armed tactical officers materialized from multiple access doors. Clad in dark tactical vests and carrying long rifles, they moved with coordinated, terrifying efficiency. The sound of their heavy boots pounding against the stone floor drowned out the fading murmurs of the crowd. They swarmed the priority lane, forming a solid human barricade around the checkpoint. "Step back!" a towering officer shouted, his voice echoing with immovable authority. He shoved a complaining tourist away from the perimeter, establishing a hard line that no civilian dared to cross. "Lock down the lane! Nobody moves!" The wealthy travelers, accustomed to VIP treatment and polite deference, shrank back in genuine fear. Their money and status offered zero protection against the tactical rifles and the blaring alarms. They were corralled like cattle behind the velvet ropes, their smartphones slowly rising to capture the chaos. Nathan stumbled backward, his shoulder colliding hard with a stack of gray plastic bins. They tumbled to the floor with a loud clatter, but he did not seem to notice. He stared at the torn cream canvas bag pinned beneath the paws of the barking dog, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. The scattered puzzle pieces in his brain finally locked together into a horrifying picture. The trap had not disappeared. It had migrated. He looked at Aubrey, watching the young woman he intended to spoil with his stolen fortune become the focal point of a major federal raid. His carefully constructed empire was burning, and the flames were rapidly advancing toward his own feet. The lead tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man projecting cold, lethal competence, approached the stalled conveyor belt. He signaled the handler to pull the frantic dog back. The handler tugged the heavy leash, wrestling the barking animal away from the luggage. The lead officer did not ask for permission. He did not request a key. He unholstered a sharp utility blade from his tactical vest, mirroring the exact tool Nathan had used in the dead of night. Grabbing the ruined designer bag by its handle, the officer yanked it onto the metal inspection table. He drove the blade into the side compartment, slicing the expensive canvas open with a single brutal motion. The sound of tearing fabric severed the very last thread of Nathan's corporate illusion. Reaching deep into the exposed lining, the officer gripped the dense black taped package. He pulled the heavy brick into the harsh fluorescent light, setting it down on the steel surface with a definitive thud. The package sat there, radiating lethal consequences. It was undeniably identical to the contraband Nathan had buried in my suitcase. The officer retrieved a chemical testing swab from a secure pouch, wiping the pad against a tiny slit in the industrial plastic. He slid the swab into a portable digital analyzer. 5 seconds later, the vial flashed a bright, undeniable blue. Positive for synthetic narcotics. The lead officer lowered the analyzer. He rested his hand on his holstered weapon, turning his steely, unblinking gaze toward the terrified couple shrinking against the wall. His voice was a low, thunderous rumble that cut through the blaring sirens and the echoing barks. Who packed this luggage? The lead officer's voice echoed through the frozen departure hall. Aubrey stood paralyzed. She stared at the black taped package resting on the stainless steel surface, her manicured hands trembling. Her polished corporate facade melted into raw survival instinct. She raised a shaking finger, bypassing the armed guards, and pointed directly at the man standing beside her. "He is my boss," Aubrey stammered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of the federal gaze. "He packed the car, he handled the bags. I do not know what that is. You have to ask him." Nathan took a stumbling step backward. His polished leather shoes skidded on the linoleum. For a man who had built a logistics empire moving heavy machinery across the treacherous Wyoming basins, losing control was an alien concept. His respiratory system failed him. He clutched his chest, digging his fingers into the expensive cashmere fabric of his coat. His complexion shifted to a sickly pale gray. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to strobe, narrowing his vision into a suffocating tunnel. His tailored outerwear felt like a lead weight pressing down on his lungs. The vibrant colors of the terminal washed out into a stark, blinding grayscale. He gasped, his throat constricting, as if invisible hands were choking the life out of him. The lead officer turned his unwavering attention toward Nathan. "Sir, is this your luggage?" Nathan opened his mouth, but only a ragged wheeze escaped. His brain misfired. He was a chief executive. He was used to commanding boardrooms, silencing dissent with a raised hand, and buying his way out of zoning disputes. But wealth offered zero leverage against a tactical rifle and a positive chemical field test. He looked at the heavy brick of narcotics. He looked at Aubrey, who was backing away from him as if he carried a contagious disease. Then his frantic, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I remained anchored to my position at the end of the collection area. My posture was upright, my hands resting lightly over the handle of my empty tote bag. I did not flinch. I offered him a silent, glacial stare. I let him read the quiet triumph etched into my features. The naive, compliant wife he had underestimated for 5 years was standing amidst the wreckage of his life, unscathed. The psychological impact of my composure hit him harder than a physical blow. The cognitive dissonance tore through his remaining sanity. He realized the trap had not just failed. It had been intercepted, reverse-engineered, and deployed against him with surgical precision. The sheer audacity of my counterstrike broke his fragile ego into jagged shards. He could not process the defeat. He could not accept that the woman he deemed a disposable pawn had checkmated him in front of the world. The primal urge to escape the sinking ship overrode his logic. He needed to prove he was the mastermind, even if it meant confirming his own guilt. He fell to his knees, his tailored slacks hitting the hard floor with a dull thud. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. He raised a shaking hand, pointing frantically toward the black package resting on the inspection table.
"That is impossible!"
Nathan shrieked. His voice tore through the terminal, a raw, high-pitched wail of desperation.
"That is not supposed to be there. That was supposed to be in my wife's bag."
The confession hung in the chilled air, echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings. The ensuing silence was profound and suffocating. The blaring alarms seemed to fade into background noise, overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of his self-destruction. The transportation security agents froze. The tactical officers exchanged swift, incredulous glances. Even the federal canine ceased its barking, sitting back on its haunches. The elite Wyoming travelers corralled behind the velvet rope stopped their murmuring. These were the very people Nathan played golf with, the investors he courted at lavish charity galas, the competitors he undercut to build his logistics routes. Now they served as his impromptu jury. Extraction tycoons, affluent tourists, and local business owners stared in stunned disbelief at the powerful chief executive groveling on the floor. A dozen smartphones rose in unison. The quiet, rhythmic click of camera shutters and the soft digital chimes of video recording starts punctuated the dead silence. They were capturing the spectacular, unvarnished downfall of a local titan. His pristine reputation dissolved into a viral spectacle in mere seconds. Every humiliating gasp, every trembling finger, immortalized in high definition. Aubrey clamped her hands over her ears. Her eyes widened to the point of tearing as the reality of his words penetrated her panic. He had just admitted his intention to frame a family member, and by extension, she realized he would have sacrificed her just as easily. She stared at the man she had allowed to dictate her career and her morality. The realization hit her like a physical strike. He had never loved her. He had never viewed her as a true partner. She was merely an instrument, a temporary vessel for his ambition, just as disposable as the wife he was trying to discard. The lavish dinners, the whispered promises in corner offices, the arrogant inside jokes they shared during the car ride. It was all a hollow transaction. A shrill, piercing shriek ripped from her throat as the illusion of their glamorous partnership shattered. It was not just born of legal terror. It was the agonizing vocalization of a woman witnessing her own devastating foolishness. The lead tactical officer did not require further clarification. He tapped the body camera mounted to his chest armor, ensuring the glowing red light captured every syllable of the unprompted admission. He signaled his team with a sharp nod. "Thank you for clarifying, sir," the officer stated, his deep voice devoid of any sympathy. "Hands behind your back." 2 armed guards surged forward. They grabbed Nathan by the shoulders, hauling him off the linoleum with brisk, unyielding force. They slammed him chest first onto the stainless steel table, right beside the torn cream canvas bag and the lethal contraband. his cheek pressed hard against the cold metal. The heavy thud of his body hitting the table sent a faint vibration through the floorboards. I savored that vibration. It was the physical manifestation of my freedom. The sharp mechanical ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs securing his wrists echoed with beautiful finality. Another pair of officers flanked Aubrey, ignoring her hysterical protests as they pulled her arms backward, binding her wrists in identical steel restraints. Nathan twisted his neck, straining against the grip of the guards. Tears of frustration and terror streamed down his face. He searched the crowd, his frantic gaze seeking me out one final time. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for help, perhaps to hurl a final curse. I did not give him the opportunity. I broke eye contact, dismissing his existence entirely. I adjusted the lapels of my coat, reached down, and wrapped my fingers around the telescopic handle of my sleek black suitcase. The wheels glided smoothly across the floor as I turned my back on the chaos. The tactical perimeter parted for me. The officers recognized a cleared, innocent passenger escaping a hostile zone. I walked with an even unhurried stride toward the sliding glass exit doors. Behind me, the chaotic symphony of justice resumed. The shouts of federal agents reading Miranda rights, the frantic sobbing of a ruined executive coordinator, and the pathetic, broken pleas of a defeated chief executive faded into the distance. The automatic doors opened, welcoming me into the bright morning. The crisp, pristine air of the high plains washed over my face, carrying the scent of pine and untainted snow. I pulled my clean luggage onto the curb, hailing a waiting town car. The trap had snapped shut, trapping the exact prey it was meant to catch. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the Jackson Hole Airport Detention Center offered no comfort. The walls were painted in a dull, institutional gray, providing a jarring contrast to the vaded timber ceilings of the main terminal just down the corridor. I walked down the narrow hallway, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the linoleum. Walking beside me was Donovan, a ruthless, corporate defense attorney I retained hours earlier. Donovan operated with the precision of a surgeon specializing in high-stakes, white-collar litigation. He possessed a sharp, unyielding demeanor, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that signaled impending doom for anyone on the opposing side of the table. Federal agents had requested my presence for a preliminary statement, given my proximity to the suspects during the arrest. They likely expected a hysterical spouse weeping over her ruined marriage. Instead, they received a former compliance auditor accompanied by premier legal counsel. We approached the observation room, separated from the primary holding cell by a pane of thick, reinforced glass. Through the transparent barrier, the glamorous facade of Nathan and Aubrey and their illicit romance had entirely disintegrated into a toxic, pathetic spectacle. They were seated at opposite ends of a scratched metal table, their wrists bound by heavy steel handcuffs. The stark lighting cast harsh shadows across their faces, stripping away their affluent aura. Aubrey looked disheveled, her pristine tailored blazer wrinkled and stained with sweat. She sat hunched over her manicured nails, picking nervously at her restraints. Resting on the metal table in front of her was a cheap white styrofoam coffee cup provided by a sympathetic guard. A distinct smear of her expensive crimson lipstick stained the rim. That vivid red mark on the disposable, fragile cup summarized the pathetic reality of their exposed affair. It was a cheap thrill, easily discarded, lacking any genuine substance. Aubrey was weeping, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. The entitlement that defined her personality just hours ago had vanished, replaced by venomous self-preservation. She glared at the man sitting across from her, her voice shrill and trembling as she spoke to the two federal investigators pacing the room. "He forced me to carry it," Aubrey cried, gesturing frantically toward Nathan with her bound hands.
He packed the car this morning. He handed me that bag and told me to keep an eye on it. I am just a coordinator. He is the chief executive. I have to do what he tells me or I lose my job. He set me up. You have to believe me. I had no idea what was inside that compartment. Nathan slumped in his chair, his custom cashmere coat stripped away, leaving him in a rumpled dress shirt. The man who spent his mornings dominating boardrooms and threatening local zoning commissions now looked like a cornered animal. He shook his head, his voice raspy and desperate, as he tried to deflect the blame back onto his subordinate. "She is lying," Nathan countered, his tone laced with panic. "The bag belongs to her. It has her monogram on the zipper. I did not pack her luggage. She is a mule trying to pin this on her employer. I run a legitimate logistics firm. I have zero connection to whatever she is smuggling." The criminals tore each other apart, severing their bond to save their own skin. The romance was dead, buried under the crushing weight of federal trafficking charges. The investigators listened to the mutual destruction with detached stoicism, taking notes on yellow legal pads. At that moment, the lead agent motioned for Donovan and me to enter the room for identification purposes. The heavy steel door clicked open. The sound halted the bitter argument instantly. Nathan and Aubrey snapped their heads toward the entrance. When Nathan saw me step into the stark room, the remaining fight drained from his posture. I stood tall, my face an impenetrable mask of glacial calm. I did not cry. I did not scream. I offered him the same quiet, observational stare I utilized when uncovering phantom assets during corporate audits. The wheels turned rapidly behind his bloodshot eyes. He looked at my composed demeanor, then down at Aubrey and her ruined designer bag resting in the corner evidence bin. The sickening clarity hit him. The realization struck with the force of a freight train. He finally understood that his wife had not been a naive, sedated victim. He realized I had remained awake at 2 a.m. I had found his trap, bypassed his locks, and orchestrated the entire reversal. He saw the calculated precision of my counterstrike, recognizing that he had vastly underestimated the woman he married. His jaw dropped open, a silent gasp of profound psychological defeat escaping his lips. He was outmatched, outsmarted, and outplayed. I did not gloat. A seasoned auditor knows that gloating is a waste of breath when the data speaks for itself. I stepped forward, approaching the metal table. The federal agents watched me with curious, calculating eyes. Donovan stood firmly at my shoulder, a silent sentinel, ensuring my rights remained protected. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved a pristine, color-coded dossier. I compiled this folder during the quiet hours before dawn, categorizing the surface-level data I extracted from Nathan and his military-grade hard drive. I slid the thick paper file across the scratched metal surface toward the lead investigator. "You will want to review this," I stated, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "While the narcotics in that bag are severe, they are merely a symptom of a much larger infection." The agent opened the dossier, his eyebrows raised as he scanned the top pages. Inside, I had organized printed copies of the fabricated emails Nathan drafted, alongside the corresponding IP addresses, proving they originated from his personal terminal. I included the initial spreadsheet of offshore routing numbers detailing accounts located in tax havens immune to standard subpoenas. "My husband intended to frame me for international smuggling," I explained smoothly, keeping my gaze fixed on the federal agent. "He engineered those emails to mimic my tone, planning to use my background in compliance as a motive. The routing numbers listed in Section 2 will demonstrate a preliminary network of hidden assets. I suggest your cyber division subpoena the communication logs between his logistics firm and those specific foreign institutions." Donovan cleared his throat, projecting his authoritative baritone across the sterile space. "My client discovered these fabricated communications prior to the flight," the attorney clarified. Recognizing the imminent danger, she secured legal representation and compiled this preliminary report. She is fully prepared to cooperate with your financial crimes unit as a witness. However, she has zero involvement with the physical contraband seized today. The suspects currently in your custody are the sole proprietors of that specific cargo. The investigator nodded, slowly tapping his pen against the color-coded tabs. This changes the scope of our inquiry significantly, ma'am. We will need to bring in the forensic accounting team. I highly recommend starting with the offshore routing protocols I advised. Tapping the second tab of the folder. Those accounts are designed to cycle capital quickly. If you freeze the corresponding domestic terminals listed on page 4, you can prevent the assets from vanishing into the ether. Nathan slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold metal table. A low, agonizing groan escaped his lips. The realization that I was actively guiding the federal authorities through his digital fortress broke his spirit. He had built his wealth on secrecy, exploiting the isolated geography of Wyoming and the blind trust of his wife. Now, that same wife was dismantling his empire piece by piece, translating his complex fraud into an easily digestible roadmap for the prosecution. Aubrey stared at the dossier, her lips parting in stunned silence. She finally comprehended the magnitude of the man she had partnered with. This was not a simple affair, nor a minor corporate indiscretion. She had entangled herself with a man executing multinational fraud, and she was currently holding the physical evidence of his crimes. The immunity she likely hoped to negotiate evaporated the moment those offshore accounts came to light. She was an executive coordinator. Her signature would inevitably be found on the corresponding transfer authorizations. The panic in her eyes solidified into raw despair. I had accomplished my objective for the afternoon. The authorities possessed the thread required to unravel his surface-level deceptions. I offered the investigators a polite, professional nod. If you require further clarification regarding the datasets, my attorney will facilitate the communication, I said, turning away from the table. I did not offer Nathan a parting glance. I did not afford Aubrey a final word. They were no longer relevant characters in my narrative. They were simply liabilities that had been neutralized and handed over to the proper authorities. I walked out of the observation room, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me, sealing them in their concrete cage. Donovan and I navigated the long corridors of the detention center in silence. We exited the administrative building, stepping out into the bright, freezing Wyoming afternoon. The mountain air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and untainted snow. The high plains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a vast landscape of opportunity and isolation. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders, exhaling a plume of white breath into the cold air. The trap had been reversed, the arrest secured, and the preliminary evidence delivered. Yet, beneath the calm satisfaction, a cold anticipation hummed through my veins. The dossier I provided only contained the surface data. I still held the encrypted hard drive containing the true depth of his corruption. The events at the airport were merely a skirmish. I looked toward the snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons, knowing the real war had only just begun. The drive back to our vast high plains estate offered a solitary journey through an unforgiving landscape. The winding asphalt carved its way through the desolate beauty of the Wyoming basins. Snow-capped ridges loomed in the distance, casting long, jagged shadows across the frozen prairie. The isolation of the region had always been a selling point for Nathan. He craved the privacy that thousands of acres of untouched wilderness provided. I navigated the heavy luxury sedan through the wrought iron security gates, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway. The sprawling timber and stone house sat silently against the backdrop of the rugged foothills. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer. The interior temperature felt noticeably cooler than the midday sun outside. Without pausing to remove my wool coat, I bypassed the grand living room and descended the staircase into the subterranean level of the property. My private office was located at the end of a long, windowless hallway. It was a secure space I maintained since my tenure as a compliance auditor for global mineral extraction firms. During those years, I learned the intricate architecture of corporate deception. I learned how executives hid stolen capital behind complex firewalls and convoluted shell corporations. I unlocked the reinforced office door and stepped into the darkness. I retrieved the ruggedized hard drive from my pocket. The metal casing felt heavy and cold against my palm. I booted up an offline server housed in the corner of the room. This standalone terminal was intentionally disconnected from any external internet network, ensuring no remote tracking software could detect my intrusion. I connected the device using a physical bypass cable. The surface-level folders containing the fabricated emails were already exposed to the federal investigators at the airport. Now I required the foundational data. I initiated a custom brute force decryption script I had engineered years ago. Lines of neon green code cascaded down my dual monitors, rapidly cycling through countless cryptographic permutations. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the machine dismantle my husband and his digital fortress. An hour passed in unbroken silence before the cryptographic lock finally surrendered. A crisp chime echoed from the desktop speakers, signaling the breach. The directory expanded on the screen, revealing a labyrinth of hidden archives. I opened the primary financial ledger. The spreadsheet stretched endlessly, documenting a staggering volume of expenditures, wire transfers, and offshore holdings. I highlighted the outgoing capital column and executed a sum function. The final figure rendered at the bottom of the screen: $12 million. The sheer scale of the theft forced me to pause. The money had been systematically siphoned from his own logistics firm over a period of 36 months. I traced the destination of the stolen capital, uncovering the mechanism of his fraud. Nathan had fabricated phantom mineral extraction leases. The Wyoming geography is dominated by vast tracts of federal and private land, frequently leased for exploratory drilling and mining operations. Nathan exploited this regional industry norm. He created fraudulent contracts for non-existent excavation sites deep within the High Plains basins. He then drafted bogus logistics orders charging his own company astronomical fees to haul imaginary heavy machinery to these ghost locations. The logistics firm paid the invoices without question, bleeding millions of dollars into an invisible void. I clicked into a subfolder containing the supporting documentation for these fake routes. I opened a specific billing file containing a digital invoice from an entity named Grand Teton Surveying. The document appeared highly professional, featuring a crisp resolution logo, itemized billing codes, and a plausible corporate address. However, my trained eyes locked immediately onto the bottom left corner of the page. The federal tax identification number formatting was inherently flawed. The sequence utilized a specific bracket structure that had been permanently retired by the Internal Revenue Service over a decade ago. A legitimate geological surveying firm would never produce such a glaring tax code error on an official financial invoice. That single, microscopic discrepancy validated my entire forensic audit. The surveying firm was a phantom entity, existing nowhere but on this encrypted drive. The stolen funds flowed from the logistics firm, through the phantom surveying invoices, and directly into the shell company I had previously identified. I navigated to the corporate registration folder, needing to understand the exact hierarchy of this hollow corporation. I opened the scanned legal bylaws and the official incorporation charter. The primary managing director was listed clearly on the first page: Aubrey Lane.
Her looping, distinct signature occupied the bottom margin, authorizing her to execute wire transfers and sign binding contracts. She was the willing administrative face of the fraud. I scrolled down to the subsequent page, reviewing the liability and indemnification clauses. The legal structure required a secondary guarantor. This individual would be legally responsible for the corporate debt and would serve as the ultimate beneficiary of the offshore accounts receiving the laundered funds. I stared at the name printed on the glowing screen. Olivia Jimenez. My breath caught in my throat. Below the typed text sat my signature. It was an immaculate forgery, capturing the precise slant and pressure of my authentic handwriting. Nathan had not merely gifted his executive coordinator a lucrative shell company. He had constructed a monumental financial crime and deliberately placed my name at the very center of the legal liability. The true, terrifying scope of his betrayal crystallized in my mind. The synthetic narcotics hidden in my luggage were merely the physical bait. He intended for the airport security dogs to flag my suitcase at the checkpoint. The federal agents would have seized the bag, discovering both the contraband and this ruggedized drive. Once government cyber units decrypted the device, they would uncover the $12 million embezzlement. They would find the fabricated emails, the phantom mineral leases, and my forged signature authorizing the entire operation. The prosecuting attorneys would review my professional background as a compliance auditor and conclude I possessed the exact specialized skill set required to engineer such a complex fraud. They would assume I utilized the stolen funds to purchase the narcotics, attempting to flee to Cabo San Lucas to escape an impending corporate audit. Nathan would have stood in the terminal, playing the role of the oblivious, grieving spouse who had been deceived by his criminal wife. I would have been buried under a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, facing a lifetime in a federal penitentiary. The stakes instantly doubled. The skirmish at the security checkpoint was a preliminary victory. I had successfully redirected the physical evidence, neutralizing the immediate threat of the narcotics. However, the legal architecture of his trap remained completely intact. If Nathan managed to point his defense attorneys toward these specific hidden files, the forged documents would still implicate me in a massive federal conspiracy. My intellectual warfare had to escalate rapidly. I needed to systematically dismantle this digital paper trail before his legal team could weaponize the forged signatures against me. While I sat bathed in the cool light of my computer monitors calculating my next defensive maneuver, the antagonist was initiating his own calculated response. Miles away, inside the sterile concrete confines of the county detention center, Nathan was granted his standard processing rights. He did not waste his time calling a bail bondsman or reaching out to a panicked family member. He stood in the holding cell, gripped the heavy plastic receiver of the wall-mounted telephone, and dialed a secure, memorized number. He was triggering a pre-planned legal failsafe. It was an aggressive contingency protocol designed to sever my resources and destroy my ability to fight back. The digital war was transitioning into a brutal legal ambush. The silence of the subterranean office provided a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside its reinforced walls. I sat, bathed in the glow of the dual monitors mapping the intricate web of phantom leases and forged signatures. The digital architecture of my husband's fraud was laid bare before me, a labyrinth designed to leave me holding the liability. Just as I traced the final sequence of fraudulent transfers, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the quiet. A quiet, chilling ping emanated from my smartphone resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. I glanced at the screen. A sterile, automated notification from my primary financial institution illuminated the dark room. It informed me that my Platinum credit card had been suspended pending a fraud investigation. 10 seconds later, a second alert arrived. My secondary checking account was locked. Then a third. The joint savings account containing our liquid emergency funds was frozen. Within the span of 2 minutes, every single financial resource bearing my name was systematically cut off.
I picked up the device, attempting to log into the online banking portal. A stark red banner greeted me, stating that access was revoked due to a pending legal injunction. Nathan was striking back. From the concrete confines of his holding cell, he had unleashed his defense attorneys. He retained a premier litigation firm located in Denver, an organization renowned for utilizing the justice system as a blunt instrument. Over the past decade, I had watched him deploy these exact lawyers to crush smaller competing logistics companies across the state. Whenever a local transport rival refused to sell their routes, Nathan would drown them in frivolous lawsuits, stalling their operations until legal fees bled them dry. He operated on a philosophy of financial starvation. He believed that if you cut off an opponent's resources, their principles would eventually crumble under the weight of sheer desperation. He was now applying that same predatory strategy to our marriage. 30 minutes after the cascading bank notifications, the security intercom at the front gate chimed. I accessed the external camera feed from my desktop. A private courier stood outside the wrought iron barrier holding a thick manila envelope. I buzzed him through, walked up the stairs, and opened the front door to accept the delivery. The courier handed me the parcel without a word, snapping a quick photograph to confirm receipt before returning to his idling vehicle. I carried the heavy envelope into the kitchen, slicing the seal open with a silver letter opener. The documents inside bore the letterhead of the Denver firm. It was an emergency order to vacate the premises. The legal argument was audacious. The attorneys claimed that our sprawling Wyoming estate had been purchased and maintained using equity diverted from his logistics firm. Therefore, they argued, the property was not a marital asset subject to standard divorce proceedings, but rather a corporate holding. Under the guise of protecting shareholder interests, they were attempting to legally evict me from my own home, demanding I vacate within 48 hours. The strategy was transparent. Nathan wanted me out on the street, penniless, frightened, and isolated in the freezing High Plains winter. He calculated that within a few days of enduring frozen bank accounts and impending homelessness, I would break. He expected me to contact his attorneys, desperate to negotiate a settlement. He assumed I would gladly hand over the decrypted hard drive in exchange for a meager allowance and a place to sleep. He viewed my survival instinct as a weakness he could exploit. He forgot that my survival instinct was honed by years of dismantling corporate predators just like him. I poured myself a glass of cold water, leaning against the marble kitchen island as I reviewed the eviction notice. I felt no rising panic. My pulse remained steady. A compliance auditor does not fear legal paperwork. We read the fine print. We look for the foundational flaws in the opposing argument. Nathan had built his financial cage using elaborate corporate structures, but structures designed to trap can often be reversed to protect. I returned to the underground office, bringing the eviction documents with me. I sat back down at the secure terminal, pulling up the bylaws of the shell company he had used to launder the stolen capital. Nathan had forged my signature to position me as the secondary guarantor, intending to make me the ultimate scapegoat for the illicit funds. He assumed that forged document was a loaded gun pointed at my head. He failed to realize that by legally tethering me to the entity, he had inadvertently handed me the keys to his entire hidden kingdom. Under Wyoming corporate law, a secondary guarantor holding unmitigated liability also possesses emergency signatory authority if the primary director is incapacitated or facing severe federal indictment. Aubrey Lane, the primary director, was currently sitting in a federal detention center facing narcotics trafficking charges. Her authority was effectively paralyzed. That left me as the sole acting executive of the holding company. I initiated a secure connection to the digital registry. Operating under my newfound ironclad authority, I accessed the shell company's core asset portfolio. Nathan had meticulously transferred the equity of our personal estate into this specific entity to shield it from taxation and potential civil suits.
The house belonged to the shell. The shell, at this exact moment, belonged to me. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, drafting a rapid series of binding resolutions. I did not merely block the eviction. I initiated an irreversible transfer of assets. Utilizing a specialized legal mechanism reserved for corporate restructuring, I dissolved his personal equity stakes tied to the property and shifted the ownership of the estate into an irrevocable, untouchable trust. I named myself as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. By the time I submitted the digital paperwork, the Denver litigation firm had lost all jurisdiction over the property. The house was locked down, legally fortified against any further assaults from his legal team. Next, I addressed the frozen checking accounts. Nathan's attorneys had placed holds on the joint funds, but they could not touch the separate corporate accounts tethered to the shell company. Since I was now the acting director, I routed a substantial operational dividend directly into a secure, encrypted offshore account I established years ago for whistleblower protection. In less than 45 minutes, I had neutralized his financial blockade, secured my shelter, and established a war chest of unassailable capital. I printed the confirmation receipts, organizing them into a neat stack. Nathan's attempt to starve me out had failed spectacularly. He had handed me the very tools required to secure my independence. The intellectual warfare was shifting entirely in my favor. I sat back in my chair, allowing a rare moment of satisfaction to wash over me. The digital chessboard was reset. I was no longer playing defense. Before I could begin formulating my next defensive maneuver against his remaining assets, an unexpected notification interrupted my thoughts. It was not a bank alert or a local courier. It was an encrypted priority email delivered to my secure personal inbox. The sender address belonged to a private server I had not seen in years. I opened the message. The text was brief, formal, and carried the weight of an execution order. It was an urgent, mandatory summons from the executive board of directors overseeing Nathan's logistics firm. The board members had been alerted to the incident at the airport. They were scrambling to contain the fallout from their chief executive being dragged away in handcuffs by federal agents. They demanded my immediate presence at their corporate headquarters in Jackson. The tone of the summons was demanding, treating me not as a partner but as a potential liability they needed to manage in silence. They wanted answers. They wanted to know the extent of the damage. They assumed they could bully the disgraced executive's wife into submission, forcing me to sign non-disclosure agreements to protect their shareholder value. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the names of the powerful men who had enabled my husband's arrogance for years. The legal ambush had failed, but a new front was opening. The corporate titans were gathering, seeking to bury the truth to save their own lucrative portfolios. I reached over, ejected the decrypted hard drive from the server, and slipped it into my leather briefcase. The war was moving from the shadows of my basement into the polished mahogany halls of corporate power. The corporate headquarters of the logistics firm occupied a prime parcel of real estate on the outskirts of Jackson. The building was a formidable structure of modern glass and dark steel, designed to project authority and wealth against the rugged backdrop of the Wyoming mountains. I parked my vehicle in the visitor slot, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked through the sliding double doors. The lobby was hushed, the receptionist offering a nervous, tight-lipped smile before guiding me directly to the private elevator. I stepped onto the top floor, the domain of the executive board. This was the nerve center of Nathan and his logistics empire. The place where he had spent the last decade orchestrating his rise to power and his subsequent descent into fraud. The receptionist led me down a wide hallway lined with framed photographs of heavy transport trucks hauling extraction equipment across snow-swept plains. We reached the double doors of the primary meeting room. She pulled them open and I walked inside. The atmosphere in the room was dense with hostility and barely contained panic.
5 senior board members sat around a sprawling, polished mahogany table. These were men of substantial wealth and influence, titans of the regional extraction and transport industries. They were accustomed to dictating terms and crushing dissent. At the head of the table sat Chairman Caldwell, a silver-haired veteran of the energy sector, known for his ruthless pragmatism. He did not stand to greet me. None of them did. They stared at me with cold, calculating eyes, assessing the liability walking into their sanctuary. "Have a seat," Olivia Caldwell instructed, his tone dismissive and flat. He gestured to a solitary chair positioned at the opposite end of the long table, intentionally distancing me from their unified front. I did not sit down. I remained standing, placing my leather briefcase onto the pristine wooden surface. I observed the men arrayed before me. They exuded a sense of arrogant entitlement, assuming they could easily manipulate the disgraced executive and his bewildered spouse. They expected a fragile woman seeking reassurance and financial support. Let us skip the pleasantries. Caldwell continued, leaning forward and folding his hands. The incident at the airport this morning is a public relations disaster. We are fielding calls from major shareholders and regional press outlets. We need to contain the damage your husband caused. The company is prepared to offer you a generous transitional stipend. In exchange, you will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement binding you from speaking about Nathan or internal operations to any federal authority or media representative. The strategy was textbook corporate damage control. They wanted to silence me with a meager payout, sweep the arrest under the rug, and distance the logistics firm from the narcotics trafficking scandal. They believed the drugs were the extent of the crisis. They had zero inkling of the financial rot eating away at their own ledgers. I unlatched the brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. "I am not here to negotiate a transitional stipend," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, unyielding authority. "And you are severely underestimating the crisis currently unfolding within your organization. The narcotics charge is a diversion. The true threat to your shareholder value is sitting inside this case." I reached into the leather compartment and retrieved the ruggedized, military-grade hard drive. I dropped it onto the table. The heavy, definitive thud of the metal casing hitting the polished mahogany boardroom table sent a shockwave through the silent room. The men stared at the device, their confident postures shifting into wary uncertainty. "That drive contains the unredacted digital archives of your chief executive," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on Caldwell. Over the past 36 months, Nathan engineered a sophisticated embezzlement operation right under your noses. He drained $12 million from your operating capital using phantom mineral extraction leases. He funneled the funds through bogus invoices billed by fake geological surveying entities, routing the cash into a shell company. The blood drained from Caldwell in his face. The other board members exchanged alarmed, frantic glances. The confident facade of the room shattered, replaced by the suffocating realization of their own catastrophic oversight. "You are making extraordinary accusations," one of the board members stammered, his voice betraying a rising tide of fear. "We have internal audits. We would have detected a $12 million deficit. Your internal audits were reviewed and approved by the very man committing the theft," I countered sharply. He compartmentalized the data. "The proof is on that drive. Every wire transfer, every fabricated lease, and every offshore routing number is meticulously documented." Caldwell stared at the metal device, his jaw tightening. "If what you are saying is accurate, you need to leave that drive here. We will initiate a private internal review and handle the situation discreetly." They still thought they could control the narrative. They still believed they could hide the rot from the public eye to protect their stock prices and personal bonuses. They failed to grasp the speed at which I was operating. An internal review is no longer an option, I replied smoothly. Before I drove to this building, I established a secure digital pipeline. I transmitted the decrypted contents of that entire drive to the Regional Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The air vanished from the room. A collective gasp of pure, unfiltered terror swept across the mahogany table. Furthermore, I continued refusing to yield a single inch of momentum. I sent a duplicate, time-stamped copy of the ledger to your internal compliance officer, Mr. Mitchell, along with a formal whistleblower notification. By this point, he is legally obligated to freeze all internal servers and report the deficit to the federal authorities to avoid personal criminal liability. The trap was sprung. The corporate executives were cornered by the very regulatory laws they sought to evade. By bringing the SEC and their own compliance officer into the fray, I stripped the board of any ability to cover up the crime. If they attempted to destroy the hard drive or silence me now, they would be guilty of federal obstruction and conspiracy. You have left us with 0 options, Caldwell whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound fear. I left you with the only option that keeps you out of a federal penitentiary, I corrected him. You will convene an emergency vote right now. You will formally terminate Nathan for cause effective immediately. You will revoke his executive shares, seize his corporate equity, and cooperate fully with the impending federal inquiry. If you attempt to shield him, the SEC will dismantle this firm and hold each of you personally accountable for the stolen capital. The men around the table were paralyzed, trapped between the wreckage of their chief executive and the unforgiving machinery of federal law. They looked at the ruggedized hard drive, then at me. The decision required no debate. Self-preservation is the ultimate driving force in corporate America. Call for a vote, Caldwell instructed, his tone hollow and defeated. Within 3 minutes, the motion was passed unanimously. Nathan was officially stripped of his title, his power, and his corporate wealth. His Wyoming empire was reduced to ash in a matter of seconds, dismantled by the woman he assumed was too fragile to fight back. I retrieved my empty briefcase, leaving the physical hard drive on the table as a parting gift. I turned and walked toward the double doors, the silence of the defeated men echoing behind me. I stepped into the elevator, descending to the ground floor. As I exited the glass doors of the headquarters and stepped onto the freezing pavement, a synchronized fleet of black sport utility vehicles sped into the circular driveway. The tires screeched against the asphalt. Dozens of agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured out of the vehicles. They bypassed me entirely, swarming the entrance of the logistics firm. They carried heavy plastic crates ready to seize corporate servers, secure financial records, and lock down the building. I walked to my sedan, the chaotic sounds of the raid unfolding behind me. Nathan was ruined, his professional life obliterated beyond repair. But the battle was not over. Aubrey was still sitting in a detention cell, likely preparing to negotiate a sweeping immunity deal by playing the naive, victimized secretary. She thought she could escape the consequences of the phantom leases. She was about to discover that my forensic audit had unearthed her undeniable complicity. The swift dismantling of the logistics headquarters sent tremors through the Wyoming business sector. While agents seized corporate servers and boxed up financial records in Jackson, another legal battle was unfolding 50 miles away, inside the United States District Courthouse. Aubrey Lane sat in a sterile conference room adjacent to the prosecutor offices, flanked by a court-appointed public defender. She was executing a calculated performance, shedding the arrogant persona she wore during the freezing ride to the airport. In its place,
She adopted the role of a fragile, manipulated casualty. She wept softly into a tissue, portraying herself as a naive subordinate who had been coerced by a domineering chief executive. Her narrative was predictable. She claimed her boss exerted undue influence over her career, forcing her to carry the designer bag under the threat of termination. She insisted she possessed zero knowledge of the synthetic narcotics or the underlying financial embezzlement. The prosecuting attorneys, hungry for a swift conviction against a high-profile corporate target, were eager to secure a cooperative witness. They prepared a sweeping exoneration agreement, ready to grant her full immunity in exchange for her testimony against her former lover. I arrived at the federal building shortly after noon, accompanied by Donovan. The icy wind whipped across the courthouse steps, but the interior corridors felt stifling. We were ushered into an austere meeting room where the lead litigator, an imposing woman named Harris, was reviewing the preliminary terms of the plea deal. Harris looked up from her legal pad, her expression betraying a hint of impatience. She explained that securing an insider would expedite the grand jury indictment against the disgraced executive. She viewed the junior coordinator as a low-level pawn, an unfortunate bystander of corporate greed who could serve a utilitarian purpose in the broader investigation. I listened to the litigator justify the leniency. It is a common phenomenon in white-collar crime. The subordinate claims ignorance, points a trembling finger at the superior, and walks away unscathed, free to reinvent their life while evading the consequences of their complicity. The young woman expected to glide through the justice system untouched, leveraging her youth to escape decades behind bars. She assumed the evidence was limited to the contraband discovered at the security checkpoint and the surface-level emails I provided earlier that day. She underestimated the depth of my forensic audit. Donovan cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the room. He informed Harris that granting leniency to the individual in the adjacent holding area would be a catastrophic procedural error. The attorney unclasped his briefcase, extracting a supplementary file I had prepared after accessing the deep archives of the ruggedized drive. He placed the heavy stack of printed documents onto the conference table. I leaned forward, addressing the litigator directly. "The narrative being spun next door is a fabrication," I stated, keeping my tone measured and precise. The coordinator was not a coerced employee blindly following orders. She was the primary managing director of the shell entity established to launder $12 million in stolen capital. Harris frowned, scrutinizing the top page of the file. The document displayed the official incorporation charter for the fraudulent holding firm. I guided the attorney through the metadata. I presented digital timestamps, proving the young woman actively accessed the offshore accounts, authorizing wire transfers from her own personal terminal during late-night hours. She did not merely facilitate the transactions. She directed them. The most damning piece of evidence lay within the physical lease contracts for the phantom mineral extraction sites. I slid a high-resolution scan of the geological surveying invoices across the table. The bottom margin of each page bore a distinct looping signature. It was an elaborate, stylized autograph featuring a dramatically sweeping initial letter that I had seen countless times on office memos and holiday greeting cards. I pointed to the ink on the page. "That signature belongs to the woman weeping in your holding room," I explained. "She personally signed off on every fraudulent lease, enriching herself through the diverted funds. She utilized the laundered capital to finance her luxury lifestyle, purchasing designer luggage and funding extravagant trips. She was an active, willing participant in a sophisticated conspiracy." The litigator stared at the looping signature, comparing it to the intake forms the suspect had signed during her processing. The match was undeniable. The digital footprints and the physical handwriting demolished the fragile victim narrative. The illusion of the coerced secretary vanished, replaced by the reality of a calculating accomplice who eagerly profited from corporate theft. Harris closed the file, her jaw tightening.
The leniency that had filled the room moments ago evaporated into a chilling silence. The attorney recognized the indisputable facts presented before her. Granting exoneration to a central architect of the embezzlement scheme was no longer a viable legal strategy. The immunity agreement, which had been mere signatures away from ratification, was abruptly rescinded. Donovan and I observed through the narrow glass window of the adjoining room as Harris re-entered the holding area. The litigator dropped the supplementary file onto the table in front of the young woman. The color drained from her face as she recognized the phantom lease contracts bearing her own distinct handwriting. Her public defender leaned in, inspecting the documents before slowly leaning back, his posture radiating defeat. There was no defense against the metadata. The digital trail was unforgiving. The tears streaming down the coordinator's cheeks were no longer a calculated performance. They transformed into genuine, hollow despair. She realized her escape route was permanently sealed. The sweeping exoneration she had been promised was gone. She was now facing the full wrath of the federal justice system, staring down a multitude of charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and narcotics trafficking. Her leverage was stripped away, leaving her entirely exposed to the severe mandatory minimum sentences attached to her crimes. Both antagonists were now locked into a bleak trajectory, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They had attempted to outsmart the system, relying on deceit and forged documents to secure an illicit fortune. Instead, they had ensnared themselves in a trap of their own making. The justice delivered was absolute, grounded in irrefutable evidence rather than emotional pleas. I turned away from the observation window, feeling a profound sense of closure regarding the former executive coordinator. Her role in the narrative was concluded. She would fade into the stark reality of the penal system, a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. Donovan gathered the remaining documents, slipping them back into his briefcase. We exited the courthouse, stepping out into the fading afternoon light. The sky over the Wyoming basins was turning a bruised shade of purple, signaling the approach of a bitter evening frost. The legal mechanisms were in motion, securing the ruin of the individuals who sought to destroy my life. However, the tranquility of the high plains felt deceptive. The financial blockade had been broken. The corporate board had terminated their chief executive. The immunity deal was crushed. Yet the primary architect of my suffering was still desperately fighting for survival. The disgraced executive had been processed and granted a temporary, exorbitant bail pending his arraignment. He was stripped of his company, his wealth, and his mistress. He was a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. And as I drove back toward the isolated expanse of my sprawling estate, I knew a man stripped of all leverage would inevitably resort to desperate measures to reclaim his shattered pride. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the high plains, plunging the vast Wyoming basin into an ocean of shadows. Inside the isolated estate, the silence felt heavy and profound, punctuated only by the haunting, isolating sound of the Wyoming wind howling against the estate's massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, freezing the gravel driveway and encasing the surrounding foothills in ice. I sat in a leather armchair in the center of the sunken living room, a cup of hot black tea resting in my hands. The warmth of the porcelain grounded my senses. I was entirely alone, yet I felt no fear. I knew exactly who was coming. As a former compliance auditor, I spent years studying the predictable behavior of cornered executives. When their fraudulent empires collapse, they do not retreat with dignity or engage in quiet reflection. They lash out. They seek a target to absorb their failure. Nathan had been stripped of his logistics firm, humiliated in a public terminal, and was currently staring down a severe federal indictment. I knew that securing a temporary, exorbitant bail would not prompt him to consult a defense strategist. It would drive his bruised ego straight to my doorstep. He needed to reclaim a fraction of his shattered dominance, and his arrogance would compel him to break the law to achieve it. I monitored the security feed from the digital tablet resting on the coffee table. Twin beams of headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the snowdrifts near the perimeter. My husband was legally barred from approaching within 500 feet of my person, courtesy of a strict federal restraining order issued immediately upon his release. Yet he retained a parasitic legal counsel who unearthed a technicality. The original property deed contained an obscure corporate retrieval clause, permitting an executive to enter the premises to secure proprietary hardware. It was a flimsy pretext, a desperate exploitation of corporate bylaws, but it provided enough justification to convince a hungry paralegal to accompany him to the property. The heavy oak front door swung open with a resounding thud. The security system did not blare because I had intentionally deactivated the perimeter alarm 20 minutes prior. I wanted him to cross the threshold. Nathan stepped into the foyer. The freezing wind swept into the house behind him before the door slammed shut. He looked nothing like the polished chief executive who had patronized me for 5 years. His tailored suit was rumpled and stained, his tie was missing, and his face was drawn and pale. He reeked of stale alcohol and desperation. A nervous paralegal lingered near the entrance, clutching a leather briefcase, visibly uncomfortable with the hostile atmosphere of the dark house. Nathan strode into the sunken living room, his shoes tracking melting snow across the hardwood floor. He spotted me, sitting calmly by the unlit fireplace. He puffed out his chest, stepping directly into my personal space, attempting to cast a long shadow over my seated figure. He wanted to intimidate me, using the same patriarchal superiority he had wielded throughout our marriage. He wanted to physically tower over the woman he deemed responsible for his ruin. "You think you are untouchable," Nathan hissed, his voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. "You think changing the trust parameters protects you from my firm. This house is a corporate asset, Olivia. I am here to reclaim company property, and I will drag you through civil court until you have nothing left." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or lean away from his towering stance. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the bitter taste. "The board of directors terminated you yesterday afternoon," I reminded him, my tone remarkably even and devoid of emotion. "You possess zero executive authority. Your presence here is not a corporate retrieval. It is a felony violation of a federal mandate." The legal reality did not register through his toxic rage. A volatile surge of hostility washed over his face. He leaned closer, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. He threatened to bankrupt me with endless litigation, promising to smear my name across the Wyoming business sector. He vowed to make my life a living hell, claiming he still controlled the local judges and the regional politicians. I observed his outburst with clinical detachment. His anger was a fragile mask concealing profound terror. He was projecting a dominance he no longer possessed. When the intimidation tactics failed to elicit a single tear or a flinch of submission, his grand facade crumbled. The transition was swift and pathetic. His rigid shoulders slumped. The manufactured rage evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening pleading. "Olivia, please," Nathan stammered, his voice cracking as he dropped to one knee beside my chair. "We can fix this. You just need to withdraw the unredacted files from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Tell them you misunderstood the accounting software. Tell the federal agents the phantom leases were authorized exploratory ventures. My defense team can spin the narrative if you walk back the submission. We built a life together. You cannot throw me in a cage." He reached out, attempting to grasp my hand. I pulled my arm away, a subtle but definitive rejection. He was grasping at fading illusions. He genuinely believed his residual charm, or my lingering affection, could override his catastrophic crimes. He thought treating me like a naive wife one last time would erase the metadata and the forged signatures. I looked down at the man who had tried to sentence me to a foreign prison. "You built a life on deception," I corrected him, my words slicing through his desperation like a scalpel. "You drained $12 million from your own logistics firm. You forged my signature to shoulder your federal liability. You packed a vacuum-sealed brick of narcotics into my luggage. There is no shared history left to salvage. You are a criminal, and I am the auditor who caught you." He stared up at me, his eyes wide, searching my face for a shred of empathy. He found only a glacial void. I set my teacup onto the table and stood up, forcing him to look up at me from the floor. "You still think you hold leverage," I continued, looking down at his pathetic frame. "You brought a paralegal to exploit a corporate retrieval clause. You assumed I locked the front gate and fortified the house in fear, but the gate was open, Nathan. The alarm was deactivated." Confusion washed over his features, slowly giving way to a sickening realization. "I did not deactivate the system to surrender," I explained softly, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "I deactivated it to ensure you entered the property unhindered. The restraining order explicitly dictates that any deliberate approach to this residence constitutes an immediate violation, resulting in the revocation of your bail. The corporate loophole you utilized only shields you from civil trespassing. It does not supersede a federal protective mandate." The color drained entirely from his cheeks. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He realized he had walked directly into another meticulously designed snare. I used his own predictable aggression against him. I knew his bruised ego could not resist the urge to confront me. He needed to feel powerful one last time, and that desperate psychological need had sealed his fate. I did not need to raise a hand or utter a threat. I simply allowed his own arrogance to destroy him. The haunting howl of the Wyoming wind against the glass was suddenly pierced by a new sound. A faint, rhythmic wail echoed in the distance, bouncing off the snow-covered foothills. The sound grew sharper, multiplying as multiple vehicles sped down the isolated highway toward the estate. Nathan scrambled backward, stumbling over his own feet as his eyes darted toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Red and blue strobe lights began to reflect against the dark glass, painting the living room in frantic, flashing colors. The local authorities alerted the moment his vehicle breached the driveway. Sensors were arriving to execute the arrest warrant. He was going back to a concrete cell, stripped of his bail, his dignity, and his final illusion of control. The paralegal dropped his briefcase and backed out the front door, fleeing the scene to avoid aiding a fugitive. Nathan stood trembling in the center of the living room, trapped by the flashing lights surrounding the property. Yet even as heavy fists began pounding on the heavy oak door, a bitter, venomous smirk crossed his pale face. He straightened his ruined suit, clinging to one final desperate secret he believed would grant him the ultimate victory over my future. The heavy oak door shuddered under the forceful pounding of law enforcement. Before the intruder could formulate another threat, the local sheriff and 3 deputies breached the entryway. The freezing Wyoming draft swept through the foyer, carrying a flurry of crystalline snowflakes that melted instantly against the hardwood floor. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the sunken living room in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. The officers moved with practiced efficiency. They surrounded the disgraced chief executive, ignoring his protests. A deputy grabbed his wrists, twisting them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel restraints echoed through the weighted space, sealing his fate. He was being arrested for a felony violation of a federal protective mandate. Yet as the cold metal locked around his wrists, a disturbing transformation occurred. The pathetic, pleading demeanor he displayed moments earlier vanished. A venomous, arrogant smirk stretched across his pale face. He believed he possessed a hidden ace, a final trump card that would guarantee his eventual victory. He squared his shoulders, looking at me with undisguised contempt. "You think you won?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think seizing the estate and terminating my corporate position leaves me powerless? You are a naive auditor. You only uncovered the operational ledgers. You missed the shadow accounts. I have $5 million buried in a Cayman Islands reserve. It is untouchable, shielded by offshore privacy laws you cannot breach. When I post my new bail, I will use every cent of that money to ruin you. I will hire a battalion of litigators to drag you through courts for the next 20 years. You will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." His threat was intended to inject terror into my veins. He wanted to see me falter, to witness a crack in my stoic facade. He desired the satisfaction of knowing his financial shadow still loomed over my future. I did not afford him that luxury. My expression remained a portrait of glacial calm. I simply reached toward the polished coffee table and picked up a thick, unsealed manila envelope. At that precise moment, tires screeched against the icy gravel outside. A sleek black sedan parked haphazardly behind the patrol cruisers. A breathless man in a wrinkled trench coat hurried through the open front door. It was Vance, the lead defense attorney from the Denver litigation firm. He had likely tracked his client via a GPS ankle monitor or received a frantic text message from the fleeing paralegal. The lawyer surveyed the scene, his eyes darting from the deputies to the handcuffed executive. "Officers, my client has the right to remain silent," Vance declared, attempting to project authority while catching his breath. "We will contest this unlawful detention in court. Do not say another word." I stepped forward, holding the envelope. "Your client is no longer capable of funding your retainer," I stated, my voice echoing with crisp, unyielding clarity. "He is entirely destitute." The litigator frowned, turning his attention to me. The handcuffed man laughed a harsh, grating sound. "She is bluffing," he told his lawyer. "She locked down the domestic accounts, but the offshore trust remains secure." I pulled a crisp stack of printed documents from the envelope and handed them directly to the defense attorney. "I suggest you review the corporate bylaws your firm drafted for the holding entity," I instructed. "You engineered a structure intended to insulate the primary director. You required a secondary guarantor to absorb the legal liability. My husband foolishly forged my signature onto that charter. In doing so, he legally granted me unilateral executive authority the moment his mistress was incarcerated." The lawyer scanned the pages, his professional composure fracturing. I did not stop at securing the estate. I continued my gaze, shifting back to the man in restraints. A thorough compliance auditor never settles for the surface data. I traced the tertiary digital pathways routed through the Cayman servers. I located your shadow reserve. All $5 million. The arrogant smirk began to waver on his lips. "You cannot touch that capital," he stammered, his confidence cracking under the weight of my precision. "The banking protocols require dual authentication. They require the signature of the active managing director," I corrected him, "a position I currently occupy. Yesterday afternoon, I executed a binding, irrevocable wire transfer, draining the offshore reserve down to a zero balance." The blood drained from his face. A panicked, suffocating silence descended upon the living room, broken only by the crackle of the deputy's radio transmitters. The disgraced executive stared at me, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the evaporation of his hidden fortune. "You stole my money," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief.
I will have you indicted for theft.
I did not steal anything, I replied smoothly. Theft implies unlawful possession. I acted in my capacity as the authorized corporate steward. I did not keep a single cent for myself. I donated the entire sum. I reached into the envelope one final time and retrieved a beautifully framed document. The heavy oak border encased a pristine sheet of heavy stock parchment. I held it up for both the criminal and his lawyer to see. During our ride to the airport, I reminded him, recalling the freezing journey through the mountains. You complained bitterly about a specific organization blocking your lucrative expansion routes. You despised their interference. I decided to facilitate a gesture of goodwill on your behalf. I routed the $5 million to the Yellowstone Wildlife Conservation Fund. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, supported only by the firm grip of the arresting deputies. The charity he loathed, the organization standing in the way of his industrial greed, was now funded by his stolen embezzlement. I turned the framed letter so he could read the embossed logo. The conservation director sent this personalized thank you note via expedited courier, I explained. They were astounded by your unprecedented philanthropic generosity. Furthermore, they detailed exactly how they deployed your financial gift. They utilized the capital to purchase the vast High Plains parcels situated directly in the path of your proposed logistics routes. Those lands are now classified as protected federal sanctuaries. You did not just lose your fortune. You permanently blocked your own company from ever expanding. The defense attorney reviewed the certified transfer receipts attached to the back of the frame. The transactions were flawless, routed through legitimate philanthropic channels, scrubbed of any illicit origin. The money was gone, transformed into untainted, charitable assets. There was no legal mechanism to reverse the donation. The fortune was permanently beyond their reach. To compound your legacy, I added stepping back to admire his utter devastation. I coordinated a press release with several regional Wyoming news outlets. The morning editions are already hitting the newsstands. The journalists are hailing you as an involuntary philanthropist. The public narrative portrays a disgraced executive who experienced a sudden crisis of conscience, giving away his hidden wealth to protect the pristine geography of the state. You are broke, facing decades in a penitentiary, and the world believes you willingly surrendered your leverage to save the elk. The poetic justice was supreme. I had stripped away his final illusion of power without resorting to illegal retaliation or bitter revenge. I weaponized his own geographic hurdles against him, turning his stolen wealth into a permanent monument to his failure. He was trapped in a flawless, inescapable checkmate. The local sheriff motioned for the deputies to remove the prisoner from the premises. The officers guided him toward the exit. He did not fight them. He did not utter another threat or hurl an insult. The venomous predator was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken shell. He stumbled forward, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the framed receipt resting in my hands. The mathematical certainty of his ruin finally crushed his spirit. He realized he had orchestrated his own destruction, handing me the exact tools required to dismantle his life. The front door closed, shutting out the freezing wind and the flashing strobe lights. The defense attorney offered a brief, stunned nod of acknowledgement before turning and fleeing into the night, abandoning a client who could no longer pay his exorbitant fees. I stood alone in the quiet expanse of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered marriage. The storm had passed, leaving a profound, settling peace in its wake. The trap was empty. The predator was caged. Now only one task remained before I could truly reclaim my future. The flashing lights of the patrol cruisers faded into the distance, carrying the ruined executive down the winding mountain road toward the county detention center. The roar of the engines dissolved, leaving behind a profound, settling quiet. I stood alone in the sunken living room of the sprawling High Plains estate. The air inside the house felt different. The stifling tension that had saturated these walls for the past 5 years was gone. The structure of timber and stone was no longer a gilded cage. It was just a house, and it was one I had no intention of keeping. I walked through the veited rooms one final time, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. I did not wander the halls to indulge in nostalgia. I moved with purpose, ensuring I was leaving nothing essential behind. My packing process was sparse and highly efficient. I carried a single canvas duffel bag. It held practical necessities. I packed my encrypted auditing laptop, several secure hard drives containing backups of the corporate data, and a few simple changes of clothing. The luxurious wardrobe Nathan had purchased to mold me into the perfect obedient trophy wife remained hanging in the expansive walk-in closets. I was shedding the artificial armor he required me to wear. I retrieved the framed letter from the Wildlife Conservation Fund, sliding it carefully into my leather briefcase. That document was the only memento I desired to keep, a tangible reminder of the exact moment intellect triumphed over arrogance. I stepped out the front door, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. The freezing Wyoming draft bit through my wool coat, but the chill felt invigorating. I tossed my bags into the trunk of my personal sedan and engaged the ignition. The engine hummed a steady, reliable rhythm. I pressed the remote sensor, watching the wrought iron security gates swing open for the final time. The tires crunched against the frost-hardened gravel as I steered onto the desolate asphalt highway. I watched the expansive property shrink in the rearview mirror. I did not shed a tear. I did not look back. Looking back implies a lingering attachment or a sense of regret, and I harbored none. The drive through the isolated basin offered a stark, breathtaking beauty. The jagged, snow-capped silhouette of the Teton Range cut a sharp, imposing line against the starry night sky. For years, I had allowed myself to be confined within the parameters of a billionaire lifestyle. I surrendered my professional independence, trusting a partner who viewed my steadfast loyalty as a tactical vulnerability to exploit. He believed my quiet demeanor equated to frailty. He failed to comprehend that a compliance auditor thrives in the quiet. We observe the subtle discrepancies. We calculate the hidden risks. We dismantle the fraudulent structures from the inside out. My professional horizon was vast and entirely clear. The corporate board in Jackson was currently scrambling to salvage their logistics firm from the impending federal inquiries. The prosecutors in the district courthouse were building an airtight indictment based on the metadata I provided. Aubrey Lane was sitting in a holding cell stripped of her immunity agreement, facing the crushing reality of her own greed. Nathan Cole was ruined, stripped of his hidden wealth, his professional reputation, and his freedom. They were permanently tethered to the wreckage of their own deceitful choices. I was tethered to nothing. I was ready to resurrect my independent consulting career. The mineral extraction firms scattered across the regional plains required rigorous, unyielding oversight, and I now possessed a fresh, unparalleled resume. The drive continued for hours as the night sky gradually yielded to a bruised purple hue, signaling the approaching dawn. The ambient temperature dropped further as I navigated the winding mountain pass, ascending higher into the rugged wilderness. The heater hummed a steady, comforting rhythm inside the cabin of the sedan. I felt an unfamiliar, deeply resonant sensation settling in my chest. It was not mere relief or fleeting joy. It was an enduring, untouchable tranquility. The suffocating anxiety that had plagued my marriage, the manufactured paranoia he used to control me, was entirely eradicated. In its place stood a crystalline clarity regarding my own capabilities. The highway eventually skirted the edge of Jackson Lake. The pristine water lay undisturbed, a mirror of dark, icy glass reflecting the towering, snow-dusted peaks. I pulled the sedan onto a secluded gravel shoulder, shifting the transmission into park. The engine idles softly, a quiet companion in the vast emptiness. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out into the biting morning air. The frost crunched beneath my leather boots. The cold stung my cheeks, awakening every nerve ending, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. I walked to the rocky shoreline, standing at the edge of the freezing water. The silence of the wilderness was profound, unbroken by the chaos of corporate greed, legal battles, or federal raids. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond wedding ring caught the faint early light breaking over the eastern ridges. It was a flawless stone, purchased with laundered capital, a glittering symbol of a domestic contract built entirely on deception. I reached over with my right hand and slipped the platinum band off my finger. It felt surprisingly light in my palm, a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating burden it had represented for the past half-decade. I did not hesitate. I drew my arm back and hurled the diamond far out over the water. The ring arched through the frigid air, glinting one last time before striking the surface. A soft, distant splash echoed across the shoreline. The ripples expanded briefly in perfect concentric circles before the icy lake swallowed the metal, erasing it from existence. The water returned to its smooth, undisturbed state. The physical tether to my past was severed, resting at the bottom of a freezing Wyoming basin. Society often conditions women to view the end of a marriage as a fundamental failure, a tragedy to be mourned and internalized. We are taught to endure, to compromise, to fix the broken pieces of the men who betray our trust. We frequently mistake endless endurance for genuine devotion. But true loyalty should never demand the sacrifice of your own dignity. Staying with a partner who actively engineers your destruction is not love. It is slow, deliberate self-erasure. When faced with a trap designed to bury me in a foreign prison, I chose to fight. I chose to live. My journey began with a terrifying discovery in the lining of a suitcase during the darkest hour of the night. It ended with the systematic dismantling of a regional industrial empire. I did not rely on emotional outbursts, frantic pleas, or irrational vengeance. I relied on data, encrypted metadata, and the unforgiving, objective nature of a financial paper trail. I weaponized my intellect to protect my future and punish the guilty. The trauma of the betrayal could have shattered my spirit, leaving me a victim. Instead, the crucible forged me into something infinitely stronger. I turned away from the lake and returned to the sedan, closing the heavy door against the Wyoming chill. I shifted into drive and merged back onto the empty asphalt highway. The sun finally breached the jagged horizon, flooding the High Plains Basin with brilliant, blinding light. The lingering shadows retreated into the crevices of the mountains. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cutting a clear, unobstructed path through the wilderness. I am Olivia Jimenez. I am a free woman. And to anyone who ever attempts to underestimate me or exploit my loyalty again, I am an extraordinarily dangerous adversary. The heavy splash of a diamond ring sinking into the icy, pristine depths of Jackson Lake is a quiet sound, yet its ripples extend far beyond the water's edge. When we reflect on Olivia's harrowing journey from a wife deliberately gaslit in the shadows of a sprawling Wyoming estate to a woman who systematically dismantled her husband's fraudulent empire, it is easy to view her story merely as a masterclass in survival and checkmate. But beneath the corporate espionage, the offshore bank accounts, and the tactical brilliance lies a much deeper, more urgent narrative. Although Olivia walked away from that freezing High Plains basin without children of her own, the chilling anatomy of her marriage leaves us with a profound blueprint for family responsibility, parenting values, and the moral inheritance we pass down to the next generation in American culture. In our society, the traditional family structure is frequently idealized through the lens of material success and outward stability. We are culturally conditioned to admire the luxury SUV in the driveway, the vated ceilings of the custom-built home, and the prestigious corporate title attached to the head of the household. Nathan constructed exactly this facade. He wanted a picturesque domestic life, not out of a genuine desire for connection, but because a quiet, compliant spouse served as the perfect invisible camouflage for his unchecked ambition and deceit. When we prioritize the aesthetics of the American dream over the integrity of the people living inside it, we create a perilous environment for children. If we raise the next generation to believe that success excuses ethical compromise, that accumulating wealth justifies the exploitation of others, we are not raising a family. We are cultivating a cartel of polite sociopaths. True family responsibility demands a radical commitment to honesty, a virtue that extends far beyond simply telling the truth about where you were on a Friday night. Honesty, in its most vital form, is the refusal to manipulate the reality of the people who trust you. Nathan's most egregious crime was not the illicit cash or the synthetic contraband. It was the psychological warfare he waged in his own living room. He systematically patronized Olivia, labeling her sharp instincts as paranoid delusions to protect his hidden life. When we raise children, we must fiercely guard their perception of reality. Gaslighting within a home destroys a child's internal compass. If parents model a dynamic where one partner routinely invalidates the other's reality to maintain control, children absorb a toxic definition of love. They learn to silence their own intuition. To guide children effectively over the long term, we must cultivate an ecosystem of unvarnished accountability, teaching them that their feelings are valid and that deception is the ultimate betrayal of the family unit. Equally paramount is the cultivation of emotional awareness, an attribute Olivia demonstrated with breathtaking precision. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, she did not succumb to the frantic, chaotic reactions her husband anticipated. She did not scream in the airport terminal or shatter dishes in the kitchen. She observed. She calculated. And she allowed her intellect to process her heartbreak. In raising children, we often focus on behavioral compliance, teaching them to sit still, be quiet, and follow the rules. But we rarely equip them with the emotional vocabulary required to navigate profound betrayal or systemic unfairness. Emotional awareness means teaching a child how to sit in the freezing discomfort of a broken promise, without letting that pain dictate their actions. It is the ability to recognize when the math of a relationship no longer adds up, and possessing the quiet strength to stop participating in the illusion. Fairness within the context of a traditional family is often misunderstood as equal distribution of chores or balanced bank accounts. Olivia's story redefines fairness as the fundamental honoring of a partner's humanity and agency. Nathan viewed his wife as a tool, a convenient, invisible asset to be deployed and sacrificed when his empire faced exposure. If children grow up witnessing a marriage where one person is treated as collateral damage for the other's comfort, they will inevitably replicate that dynamic, becoming either the predator or the prey. Teaching fairness means demonstrating that no amount of ambition, corporate leverage, or financial security ever grants you the right to strip another human being of their dignity. As we navigate the complexities of modern domestic life, we must ask ourselves what kind of legacy we are truly building behind our closed doors. Are we constructing a sanctuary of mutual respect, or are we meticulously decorating a cage? If the themes of hidden truths, the courage to walk away, and the relentless pursuit of self-respect resonate with the silent battles you have fought in your own life, I invite you to subscribe and follow Samantha Told Stories. We explore the deep, often unspoken narratives that shape our relationships, offering a space to reflect, heal, and find the strength to rewrite your own ending. Ultimately, Olivia's departure into the Wyoming horizon forces us to confront a deeply ingrained societal myth about loyalty. We are taught from a very young age that endurance is the highest form of devotion. We are instructed to weather the storm, to stand by our partners through every hardship, and to keep the family intact at all costs. But staying with a partner who actively engineers your destruction is not an act of nobility. It is an act of self-erasure. The conventional wisdom dictates that a broken home is a tragedy to be avoided at all costs, a failure of commitment that inherently damages the children within it. But a home that remains whole while rotting from the inside out is infinitely more destructive. Sometimes the most profound protective act of family responsibility you can ever model for a child is the willingness to pack your bags and leave. True loyalty should never require the sacrifice of your own soul. The most vital lesson we can impart to the next generation is this: the foundation of a family is not built on the bricks of endurance, but on the courage to strike a match and burn the illusion to the ground the moment it demands your dignity.